What if suffering isn't the enemy, but the teacher? What if the darkness you run from is the only path to light? Dostoevsky once wrote, "Man is a mystery, it must be solved." But perhaps he wasn't writing about others. Perhaps he was writing about himself, a man who walked through prisons, poverty, and madness, only to discover something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding: that to understand the human soul, you must first walk into its shadows. He began his journey in the icy corridors of St. Petersburg, a city that always seemed half asleep under gray skies. As a young writer, Fyodor Dostoevsky believed in change. He joined a circle of dreamers, intellectuals, and socialists who believed words could heal society. But dreams in Russia were dangerous. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for treason. He stood in front of a firing squad moments away from death. And just as the order to fire was about to be given, a messenger arrived. The Tsar had commuted his sentence to hard labor. What he experienced that day would fracture him forever. Death had stared into him and left something behind. How do you live after your own execution? How do you return to a world that has already buried you once? For Dostoevsky, this near-death moment wasn't just an event. It became the philosophical seed of his entire life's work. He would spend the rest of his days trying to understand why people do evil, why they destroy what they love, and whether redemption is ever truly possible. To Dostoevsky, man was never a machine of reason or a sum of social expectations. He was a trembling frontier where heaven and hell met within the same heartbeat. Within him, light and shadow wrestled endlessly, not to destroy each other, but to reveal what it means to be alive. He distrusted the tidy certainties of ideologies, their cold geometry, their promise of order. Because to him, truth could never be contained by logic alone. It pulsed, flawed and bleeding, in the human soul. The sinner's remorse, the madman's vision, the lover's despair. These were the scriptures he trusted more than any doctrine. Dostoevsky saw holiness in contradiction. Raskolnikov, who kills out of theory yet dies out of love. Prince Mishkin, whose goodness is so pure it almost drives others insane. Ivan Karamazov, who denies God yet cannot stop longing for him. Through them all, Dostoevsky told one story: that man is both divine and broken, and that freedom is the space in between. For Dostoevsky, to be human was not to be pure, but to be torn. To stumble between faith and doubt. To love even through despair. To bear the unbearable awareness of choice. Because freedom, in his vision, was not a comfort, it was a cross. It is the space between salvation and ruin, the trembling moment where we decide who we are. Freedom, he wrote, is not given to make us happy, but to make us human. And sometimes, that humanity demands that we walk willingly into the fire. To most, suffering is a curse to be silenced, a darkness to outrun. But to Dostoevsky, suffering was not the enemy, it was the crucible in which the soul is forged. He believed that pain, far from being meaningless, was the very spark that awakens consciousness. Through anguish, he said, man begins to see not the world as he wishes it to be, but as it truly is. This was not the worship of pain, but its transfiguration. For Dostoevsky, suffering stripped away illusion, tore from us the masks of pride, of comfort, of borrowed belief, until what remained was the raw, trembling truth of being human. He understood that without the sting of guilt, there is no moral awakening. Without despair, there is no longing for redemption. It is only when a man feels the full weight of existence, its injustice, its absurdity, its grief, that compassion can be born. Not the hollow compassion of sentiment, but the fierce tenderness that comes from knowing one's own darkness. This was Dostoevsky's terrifying mercy, that suffering is not punishment, but invitation. An invitation to descend into the depths and discover what cannot be found in comfort, the radiant fragility of the soul, the quiet dignity of endurance, the divine echo that still whispers within pain. His message was simple, yet terrifying. The more we run from suffering, the less human we become. The more we embrace it, the closer we come to truth. Before prison, Dostoevsky was a believer in utopia. He admired the socialist dream of equality, justice, and fraternity. He read the European philosophers and imagined a world built on reason. But the Siberian camps burned that dream to ashes. When he returned, He no longer believed in systems, he believed in souls. He saw that no ideology could save man if the heart remained corrupt. And so he turned inward, to faith not as dogma, but as an existential act. For him, faith was not certainty, it was rebellion against despair. He wrote that even in the darkest night, the soul must love life more than its meaning. Because perhaps meaning is not found, it's suffered into being. As Dostoevsky grew older, his voice grew louder, not just as a novelist, but as a prophet. He began to speak of Russia's destiny, of the spiritual mission of the Slavic world. He believed Russia could unite broken nations through compassion and faith. But his vision, steeped in Pan-Slavism, carried contradictions that would echo through centuries. Today, some accuse him of nationalism, of planting the seeds of imperial ideas that still haunt us. And yet, to judge him by today's wars is to misunderstand the man. Dostoevsky did not glorify power, despised cruelty. He dreamed, perhaps naively, of a brotherhood born not of conquest, but of shared suffering, a world where pain unites rather than divides. Still, his words have been twisted, weaponized by those who mistake his faith for fanaticism. But literature is not responsible for the sins of politics. To erase him would be to erase the mirror he still holds to us all. Dostoevsky was not a philosopher in the academic sense. He left behind no systems, no formulas, no polished doctrines to be memorized or debated. He did not argue, he revealed. His philosophy was not born in the quiet of libraries, but in the chaos of the human heart. He wrote not to explain existence, but to wrestle with it. His novels were living laboratories of the soul. Each page throbbed with the pulse of a mind on fire with contradiction. He did not seek tidy conclusions because he knew that truth, when lived, is rarely tidy. Instead, he invited us into the storm, the trembling, blood-warm confusion of being human. In The Brothers Karamazov, he stared unblinking into the mystery of evil and innocence, asking whether faith can survive the suffering of a single child. In Notes from Underground, he dissected the curse of overthinking, that fever of consciousness that isolates man even from himself. And in Crime and Punishment, he transformed philosophy into a living trial, not of reason, but of the soul, torn between logic and love. Through these worlds, Dostoevsky made philosophy breathe. He gave ideas a heartbeat, a face, a trembling voice. He did not teach ethics, he made us feel moral anguish. He did not argue for God, he made us ache for meaning in his silence. He turned philosophy from an abstract discipline into a human drama, where ideas lived and died in the space between crime and confession, sin and grace. In Dostoevsky, thought becomes emotion, emotion becomes revelation. He made readers experience the question before they could even name it, and in that trembling, wordless space between empathy and judgment, between despair and redemption, philosophy was reborn. Today, some seek to cancel him, to silence a man who lived 2 centuries ago for the sins of those who misuse his words. But to erase Dostoevsky is to erase one of humanity's mirrors. His darkness is not there to glorify pain, but to help us understand it, to remind us that in each of us, good and evil wrestle endlessly. His work asks, can freedom exist without responsibility? Can love survive in a world without faith? And can man bear to face himself without losing his mind? These are not Russian questions. They are human ones. And that is why Dostoevsky still speaks to us, because the world he saw is still the one we live in. Perhaps Dostoevsky's greatest lesson is that truth cannot be clean. It bleeds, it trembles, it hurts. But if we dare to face it, if we let suffering teach instead of destroy, we might finally see what he saw in that frozen cell in Siberia. That even in darkness, the human soul can still burn with light.